Caleb. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Felicia Bartow, and I'm the Vice President of Grantmakers concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, or GCIR. And I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Some of you may already be familiar with GCIR, but for those who aren't, I wanted to share a very brief overview of our work. For about the past 25 years, GCIR has sought to influence philanthropy to advance the contributions and address the needs of the country's growing and increasingly diverse immigrant and refugee populations. We seek to promote effective grant making that not only improves the lives of newcomers, but also strengthens communities. GCIR works with a network of about 100 member foundations, but also with the broader philanthropic community on a wide range of immigration and immigrant integration issues, including education, health, workforce and employment, civic participation, racial and economic justice, and other concerns affecting immigrant children, youth, and families. Some of our members have longstanding immigrant-specific funding initiatives, but most incorporate immigrant and refugee issues into their core grant-making programs. We're extremely pleased to be co-sponsoring today's webinar with Workforce Matters. As you will hear today, these types of conversations are really critical given the role and the importance of immigrants in our workforce. They represent about 1 in 6 workers in the U.S. today. But there's still much work to be done in order to break down some of the silos that exist in philanthropy in the field when it comes to those operating in both the workforce and immigration space. So we hope that this conversation, among others, will help contribute to that process. So I'm just going to briefly review the agenda for today. Caleb, if you can advance to the next slide, and then I'll turn things over to Matt Bruce. After you hear a welcome from Matt, Irene Lee with the Annie Casey Foundation will be making some opening remarks and reviewing the goals for the webinar. Next, we'll hear from Amanda Bergson-Shilcock with the National Skills Coalition, who will provide the lay of the land in terms of workforce and skills policies, followed by Josh Delick with the National Immigration Law Center, who will provide an overview of the immigration policy landscape. You'll hear some funder examples of work at the intersection of immigration and workforce, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A and discussion when the lines will be unmuted. So we encourage all of you to share your questions via the chat feature until we open up the lines. And if some folks are not hearing the audio, so Kayla, oh, someone just sent them the call-in number. Okay, great. So with that, I want to turn to Matt Bruce, who's the Executive Director of the Chicagoland Workforce Funder Alliance, and his organization is also the host organization for the Workforce Matters Steering Committee. So Matt, let me turn things over to you to say a bit more about your work.
Great, thank you, Felicia. So I'm Matt Bruce. I'm the Executive Director of Chicagoland Workforce Funder Alliance, and I'm putting on my Workforce Matters hat for this call. Workforce Matters is a national affinity group for funders who are focused on workforce development. I can learn more about us at workforce-matters.org, but I believe that website will be in the materials somewhere. We're thrilled to co-host this webinar with GCIR. I want to thank Felicia and her team for all the collaboration that went into putting this together, and actually our conversations going back over a year. The reason that I'm in this role is I'm on the steering committee for Workforce Matters and on the executive committee for it. We are a funder collaborative in Chicago focused on workforce development. Many of our members are Workforce Matters members, how long-standing. And about a year and a half ago, we became the host, the physical agent for Workforce Matters. So I'm thrilled to also thank and welcome Sarah Oldmixon and Lucy Leung, who are the new consultants to Workforce Matters, who are really injecting new energy into the affinity group this year and have really done a great job collaborating and bringing this webinar together and really putting Workforce Matters on a great track for this year and next. I also want to thank the speakers who from our partners who came together for this webinar. It's been great to see how the content's really come together. I'm really excited because I feel that this webinar is really what Workforce Matters is about. It's about leveraging collective knowledge and relationships. It's about creating a learning community for workforce funders across the country, and it's really intended to lead to smarter workforce development philanthropy. And I see this webinar as really fitting squarely with what Workforce Matters is meant to do. So I think workforce development funders both want to and have a lot to learn about immigrants and immigration policy and immigration issues in general. So I'm excited to get to it. I'm going to pass the baton to Irene Lee from the Annie Casey Foundation, which is also a great supporter of both our affinity groups, and talk about our goals for the webinar today.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank Felicia and Matt as the vocal representatives on today's webinar for connecting our two networks of funders. As I looked at the list of funders who had RSVP'd, I really was struck by the diversity, whether it was a locally based funder network, corporate, or national. So I think the timing of this learning webinar really reflects the intersection of opportunity both in policy and practice, and I'm looking forward to our discussion from our two speakers. Caleb, or somebody could advance the slide to the webinar goals. I think that we hope to achieve 4 learning results. First, as you'll see, is to really understand how the new federal and state policies do offer new opportunities to include immigrant workers, both documented and undocumented, to more fully participate and be supported in skills training, credential attainment, and workforce development programs. We also think it's really important to begin to appreciate the numbers and characteristics of immigrant workers as part of the country's changing demographics, particularly in the South and Southwest. Thirdly, to understand the workforce dimension of various immigration programs. And finally, to hear some funder examples and also build in some possible next step learning and action possibilities in our philanthropic roles and networks. After each presentation, we're going to take a pause, and Sarah Oldmixon will moderate and try to triage any clarifying questions that come in. So after Amanda's presentation, there'll be an opportunity for folks to submit some clarifying questions, and after Josh's presentation as well. And then finally, we'll end today's webinar with 2 polling questions, which Caleb from GCIR will show us on the screen, and then we'll do some quick closing wrap-up remarks and some directions on how to connect to resources following up this webinar. So with that, I'm going to invite Amanda from the National Skills Coalition to kick us off, and just we have an overall mute, but let us know if you're hearing some rustling. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene, and thank you to GCIR and Workforce Matters for coordinating this webinar, to Sarah and Losi for their contributions, and particularly to the Casey Foundation, which has been such an important supporter of this work in so many arenas, including in my own role at National Skills Coalition. NSC is a policy advocacy organization focusing on adult education and workforce development. My particular area of focus is immigrant workforce issues. So what we're going to do today in the next 20 minutes or so is start with a sort of grounding in the demographic data. Who are immigrant workers? What are the demographics? And then move into workforce policy and go through some of the major federal skills policies and how immigrants fit into each of those policies. As Irene just mentioned, we are going to have time for a few clarifying questions at the end of my presentation before Josh kicks off his piece. And then, of course, we'll have a longer Q&A and discussion period at the end of this webinar. Okay. So as just mentioned, I'm going to start off with an overview of sort of who are immigrant workers in the United States. Immigrants are about 13% of the U.S. population and about 17% of the workforce. those numbers are slightly below where they were 100 years ago. So the historic peak of immigration in the United States happened really between the 1890s and the 1910s. So percentage-wise, we're still a little bit below those high numbers. The majority of immigrants today are working age, as you can see from the slide here and the percentages, but it's perhaps more vividly illustrated with this diagram. So this is a little bit complex. Let me walk you through it. On the left-hand side, you have the sort of turquoise and purple. Those are immigrants. On the right-hand side, you have the blue and the orange, and those are native-born U.S., native-born Americans. And in both cases, the youngest part of the age pyramid is at the bottom, right? So children are at the bottom. And you can see in general that there are relatively few foreign-born children ages 0 to 4. And if any of you have ever had a toddler, you can imagine why. It's hard to pick up and move across the world when you have very young children. Immigrants are more likely to actually either have their kids after they get here or perhaps come with slightly older children. And so you'll see as you go steadily up the screen of the left-hand side of the turquoise and purple there that there's a bulge in the middle for immigrant populations. And what that really signifies is immigrants are generally working age. They are typically between 18 and 64, often even really between 18 and 55. Unlike that native-born pyramid over on the right-hand side of the screen in the blue and orange, where you see that native-born kids including, of course, the children of immigrants who are born in the U.S., so there's a pretty robust youth population, and of course there's a much larger elderly population on the U.S.-born side of the screen. So that's just a helpful sort of overview of how immigrants are fitting into the overall U.S. population. Turning now to region of origin. So we often hear about immigrants from Latin America and particularly from Mexico. Certainly they do represent a significant chunk of immigrants in this country, but as you see from this chart, it's actually just over half of immigrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, so including places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic as well as Latin America. Another large chunk of immigrants coming from Asia, about 30%, another 11% from Europe, and then smaller chunks from Africa and from Oceania, which those of you who are thinking back to 3rd or 4th grade may remember is the catch-all for Australia, New Zealand, and a couple of other sort of far-flung South Pacific areas of the globe. Immigration status, we hear a lot about people who are undocumented, and indeed there are about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. About 3/4 of immigrants, however, do have legal status, and that includes those who are naturalized U.S. citizens as well as those who have permanent residence, which is what is often colloquially referred to as green card holders, as well as a number of other kinds of immigration status. Some of you may be familiar with temporary protected status, which is often awarded after a natural disaster, so for example after the Haitian earthquake, and there are a variety of other statuses, but naturalized citizens and green card holders do make up the largest percentages of immigrants who are not undocumented. Turning now to educational attainment, so immigrants in red here, U.S.-born Americans in blue. The population that we're looking at here is all adults over the age of 25. And here you can see that immigrants are overrepresented at the low end, that is, people who've completed less than high school. And they're also slightly, or almost equal rather, to the U.S.-born at the high end of the scale, that is, people who've achieved a graduate or professional degree or a bachelor's degree. Looking at it a slightly different way, immigrants have a higher labor force participation rate than the U.S.-born. They're also, unfortunately, more likely to be underutilized. So some of you may have heard about this described as brain waste, where immigrants come with a college degree from their home country but are perhaps working in a low-wage job that doesn't really draw on their full skills and abilities. And you can again see the immigration numbers are red here compared to blue for the U.S.-born. And now we're taking another look at educational levels and English skills. This population is a bit different. So we were looking before
at adults age 25 and over. These are adult workers age 16 and over, so it's a bit of a different cut. And the percent low educated, that's workers with less than a high school diploma, and percent high educated, that's workers with at least a bachelor's degree. And I think really that the take-home message from this slide is that half of all immigrants who are in the workforce have limited English proficiency. 48% of immigrant workers age 16 and over in the workforce have limited English. So this is a key issue as we think about the intersection between adult education and workforce development. English is just an overarching factor for so many folks. And then briefly around occupation, the print on this one is a little bit smaller, so let me draw your attention to a couple of the key findings. Again, immigrants in red, U.S.-born workers in blue. Immigrants are overrepresented in service occupations, right? So you can think of hotel housekeepers, you can think of nail salon workers, you can think of automotive repair folks, a whole range of services, both personal and otherwise. Immigrants are also overrepresented in construction and maintenance occupations, right? So you can imagine people hanging drywall or doing other kinds of labor-oriented positions. And then unsurprisingly, U.S.-born workers overrepresented in management, business, and science, in part because those are often fields that draw on and require high levels of English fluency, but also because some of those tend to require more social capital, the kind of social capital that you get from going to graduate school in the U.S. and acquiring a bunch of relationships, if you can think about the kind of white-collar jobs where folks get hired not only because they have technical skills, but also because they have those personal connections. So that's the sort of overview of the occupation slide. That was a very quick overview, and I'm going to urge that for any of you who have particular interest in the immigrant workforce in a particular state or region, there are some absolutely terrific fact sheets available from the Migration Policy Institute. And of course, I'm available as a resource person if you have follow-up questions after this webinar about the geographic area where your foundation is doing funding or about a particular population group. So now that we've done a sort of quick tour through the demographic overview, I want to talk about some of the key federal workforce policies and how immigrants fit into those policies. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of a laundry list here, and we're not going to attempt to go through every one of these on today's webinar, but I really wanted to think as big as possible in really talking, okay, what does skills policy include? And you see there's quite a list on this slide, and it includes everything from career and tech ed, which we used to call vocational education, and it includes high school-based programs as well as post-secondary. It includes English language classes and adult basic education, or what we might call GED classes, and a whole host of other activities up to and including higher education and access into four-year colleges and universities. So it's a pretty broad range, and it serves an equally broad range of people. And I flagged this slide just because sometimes the categories that workforce development divides people into are not always intuitive if you don't work in the workforce field, right? Most of us don't go around saying, well, I'm a dislocated worker, or, you know, my brother-in-law is an incumbent worker. So there's a little bit of jargon in the workforce field and some different ways of slicing, again, the populations that can be served by workforce programs. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into some of the specific policies. Just as a reminder, you can sort of start the clock with workforce policy, depending on how you want to frame it, either back in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, or really in the 1960s as part of the War on Poverty and President Lyndon Johnson. And I've listed here the sort of progression of workforce legislation. It's less important that you remember what the specific name of a piece of legislation was or what years it was in effect. It's more important to think of federal workforce policy as something that really came into being at a time when immigration was at a low ebb in the United States. less than 5% of the U.S. population was foreign-born in the early 60s through late 60s as these policies were really getting underway. And so we have a workforce system that was designed in many ways for an America that looked very different than the America today. And you'll remember that we now have a population that's about 13% foreign-born and a workforce that's about 17%. The other thing to keep in mind, particularly if you don't spend a lot of time working in workforce yourself, is that there's been a drop in capacity of the federal workforce system because there's been a drop in federal investment. And the real high water mark was in 1979 under President Carter, when there was funding of about $18 billion in the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. Just as a point of comparison, we're now working under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which in Titles I and II, which covers adult education and workforce, has about $3 billion. So we've gone from $18 billion under CETA to $3 billion in WIOA at a time when the population in need of these services has only grown. You're going to hear me refer to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act as WIOA, just because that's a faster way to say it. Really two things to know about WIOA. It did pass in an overwhelmingly bipartisan reauthorization a couple of years ago, but I like to say that the price of getting overwhelming bipartisan support is that Congress kicked the can down the road a little bit in terms of some tough issues. So they didn't, for example, tackle the issue of immigration status, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because they wanted to have a piece of legislation that could have broad bipartisan support. Okay, so what's in WIOA? Title I is workforce, again with about $2.5 billion in funding, everything from fairly basic services, helping people do online job applications, resume help, mock interviewing, to more intensive job training. And Title II is adult education, which includes adult basic education, adult secondary ed, which is what we often think of as high school equivalency or GED, and English language classes. Title I has a more standardized infrastructure nationwide. That is, all of the money for Title I gets disseminated through a state agency, typically the State Department of Labor. Every state also has both state and local workforce development boards, and the law spells out who needs to be on those boards. And both the spending and the implementation of services are really guided through state and local WIOA plans. Services can be provided either through what are often called the one-stop centers or through subcontractors such as nonprofit organizations or community colleges that are eligible training providers or otherwise able to provide services. And so from an immigration perspective, you can think about immigrant-serving organizations who could be eligible to receive WIOA funding to serve job seekers in their communities. And in fact, there are some examples of that. Title I requires work authorization. So immigrants who are naturalized U.S. citizens, immigrants who have green cards, immigrants who have other types of work authorizations are eligible. And that does include DACA recipients. Josh is going to talk more about deferred action for childhood arrivals in his part of the presentation. But the important thing to know is the federal government has issued policy guidance making it very clear that DACA recipients are eligible for WIOA Title I. We don't know how many immigrants are actually getting served under WIOA because WIOA doesn't collect that information. But we do know that a tiny percentage of the people who get to participate in job training have limited English. And you can see on the slide here it's not even 1.5% of training participants. In addition to the programs that are known as adult and dislocated worker programs, there's also youth programs. And the important thing to know here is that many immigrant youth can fit into these categories for in-school youth and out-of-school youth. So if you're a funder that is doing youth work, this might be an area that's worth digging a bit deeper in. And again, I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So turning to Title II, which is the adult education piece, unlike Title I, where you have the whole standardized infrastructure where every state has a workforce board and every state has one-stops, in adult ed, it's a whole different ballgame. Some states run their systems through their community colleges. Some states run them through their K-12 school districts. Some states run them through community-based nonprofits. Some states are kind of a hodgepodge. And there's huge variation in terms of how much money states themselves are putting into adult ed. So at one end of the spectrum, you have California, which puts about $500 million in for their adult education block grant, which is about $5 for every $1 the feds put in. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Colorado, which only in the past couple of years even provided any state funding, and now provides just under $1 million statewide for adult education. Title II does not inquire about immigration status. So undocumented immigrants can participate in adult ed programs. Arizona and Georgia do have restrictive state-level immigration laws that prevent immigrants in those states from accessing Title II, but in the other 48 states, there's no restriction. And again, we don't have any data on how many immigrants are in WIOA Title II classes, but we do know that 700,000 people are in English language classes, and we can make a reasonable assumption that most of those folks are immigrants. Obviously, some of them are likely to be from Puerto Rico and are U.S. citizens. And just a key point to mention, you remember in the earlier slide when we were talking about demographics, I mentioned that half of all immigrant workers have limited English. The U.S. is a pretty notable labor market compared to other OECD countries in that pretty much as your English gets better, you get better jobs. You get better wages. You have more opportunities. So there's a very strong correlation as your English and other skills improve in actually getting better job opportunities. So it's an investment that can really pay off. So moving away now from WIOA, which is the first federal workforce policy that we talked about, we want to talk a little bit about SNAP, employment and training. So SNAP ENT varies pretty dramatically from state to state. It is a program that helps people who are currently receiving food stamps to be able to get job training and other assistance so they can move off of food stamps. And there are several kinds of funding that are available. States automatically get some money, which is known as 100% money, although they may not necessarily spend it all, and if they don't, then it will go back to the federal government. But there's also uncapped federal reimbursement. That is, if the states have what we refer to as 50-50 matching funds, they can draw down an unlimited amount of federal matching dollars. And that can be pretty significant. Washington State is really the leader here in its SNAP ENT program. And different states, and particularly counties, which is often where SNAP is implemented, have really wide latitude in deciding, is our SNAP ENT program going to serve 200 people a year, or is it going to serve 4,000 people a year? And notably, the funding for SNAP ENT can cover a huge variety of costs as long as they're directly related to job training. And that includes everything from child care and transportation to things like uniforms and work boots. So this is important to know because it's housed in the Department of Agriculture. People often don't think of it as a workforce or a skills program, but it is. And it can be one that can serve immigrant and limited English proficient individuals, right? So in order to be eligible, you have to be food stamp eligible. And if you have questions about sort of which immigrants fall into that category, you can certainly ask those during the Q&A, and I know that Josh and Nilk have a huge depth of expertise on this question. We don't know nationally how many immigrants or limited English speakers are participating right now in SNAP ENT programs, but we do know that there are some states that have particularly identified English learners as a target population to be served by their SNAP ENT program. So there's a lot of room for growth there, and the federal government is actually ramping up its technical assistance to states with SNAP ENT, and we can certainly talk more about that in the Q&A if folks have questions. The Perkins Act is the last major federal skills policy I'm going to talk about. Perkins is career and tech ed, or as I said, what we used to call vocational education, about $1 billion in funding that goes to the states. some to the high school level, that is secondary, and some at the post-secondary level. And notably I jumped over a Perkins slide here, I think. Okay. Perkins is not an individual participant program. That is, you don't sit down and get screened yourself as an individual person. Rather, it covers costs of developing programs that a school district might have or a community college might have. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for immigrants for a variety of reasons, but most notably because if you're in high school, you have the right under the Supreme Court ruling Plyler v. Doe to attend high school regardless of your immigration status. So that means if you're in high school and you want to access a Perkins-funded career and tech ed program, they should not be screening you for your immigration status in order to participate in that program. If you are in post-secondary, it's a whole different playing field because the Supreme Court ruling does not apply for post-secondary education. And again, with Perkins, we don't have data to know how many immigrants participate nationwide. We do know how many English learners are participating, and you can see those numbers here in red on this slide. I will also add that interestingly enough, if you look state by state in Perkins ELLs, some of the states you would expect to see are there, that is states with really large immigrant populations, but there are also states with much smaller immigrant populations that have high levels of English learners participating in CTE. So those are the three policies that I'm going to talk about in depth today as I turn it over to our next presenter, just flagging the other policies that exist out there. The Higher Education Act, which of course includes Pell Grant funding, that's about $30 billion nationwide, temporary assistance for needy families, better known as welfare, and community development block grants, which are not often thought of as workforce or skill building programs, but actually can be and have been used very creatively by some communities to provide job training and English language workforce programs for immigrants and for other participants. So again, the take-home message here is that you can put an immigrant lens on federal workforce policy and sort of think about those policies in a different way when you're trying to think about how they can serve immigrant workers. In addition to the federal policies that I just went through, there are also some really effective state policies. And that's, again, something we can talk about in the Q&A or I can follow up individually with. And then finally, as a policy advocacy organization, National Skills Coalition and our partners are engaged in policy advocacy to ensure that these programs are implemented in a way that they really are as effective as possible. So that concludes my portion. I'm going to turn it to Sarah now to handle any clarifying questions that may have come up while I was talking.
Sure, Amanda. We did have just a couple of clarifying questions. First, you cited some statistics on the size of the undocumented population, and someone was curious about how you measure the size of the undocumented population.
Sure. So there's a couple of methodologies that have been developed. One is known as the residual method. There are a handful of demographers in this country that are really specialists in this. Jeff Passel is one. There are a couple of other folks, but basically one of the most common ways of measuring undocumented people is to count all of the people and then subtract the people that you know entered legally in the United States, and the remaining number are sort of hypothesized to be undocumented. So that's the residual method. And we do that because the U.S. Census, when they're doing both the census and the American Community Survey, they collect data on everybody. So they do not ask specifically about immigration status. They just say, are you a U.S. citizen or not a U.S. citizen, and were you born in the U.S. or not? So you can use data from the census to then compare that to immigration data about who we know has come into the country, who we know has exited the country, and do some fairly sophisticated statistical analyses to come up with the best available estimates. And there's actually quite a bit of literature out there about how these estimates are derived and why they are considered defensible, but that's the kind of very quick layperson explanation.
Great, thank you. And another question, someone asked if you were aware of any examples of efforts to incentivize greater utilization of SNAP ENT dollars for immigrants.
That is a great question. So there's a lot happening with SNAP ENT right now. When Congress passed a farm bill 2 years ago, it included funding for 10 states to do pilot innovation grants to see what models work best for SNAP ENT. I think at least 3 of those states identified limited English-speaking food stamp recipients as one of their target populations. So those innovation grants are underway right now, and there's an evaluation component to those, so we'll find out how well they're working. The second thing is that the federal government this year did a series of another 10 grants to 10 other states and counties called SNAP to Skills, which is a technical assistance initiative that's really designed to help states come up with, to be able to really fully utilize the SNAP ENT program and to fully draw on its capacity. And I know, for example, Fresno, California was one of the winning states for that. And I know there are several states that are particularly interested in their LEP food stamp population, their limited English food stamp population, and how to help them. The technical assistance provider that the feds have contracted with is called Seattle Jobs Initiative, and National Skills Coalition has actually published a brief in collaboration with SJI that looks at how Washington State as well as 4 other states have implemented SNAP ENT and what some of the implications are for doing it well. So it's a really exciting moment. The federal government is putting more attention on SNAP ENT than they ever have before. And they've gone at the federal level from literally having 1 staffer at the Food and Nutrition Service whose job it was to look at SNAP ENT to having 14 staffers. And they've also funded this new Center of Excellence to provide this technical assistance. So this is a really opportune moment for SNAP ENT, and there's a lot of folks who want to work as hard as possible to make sure that it can really be exploited in the best sense of the word to its full potential.
And I think that's it for our clarifying questions for now.
Great. Let's turn it over to Josh to walk us through the bookend of today's webinar. So Josh, I'm going to just invite you to start in with your presentation.
Great, thanks. My name is Joshua Stalick. I'm an attorney at the National Immigration Law Center. I wanted to start out by thanking GCIR, Workforce Matters, and the Annie Casey Foundation for making this webinar possible. I'm really excited to see this webinar come to fruition, and also want to recognize the amazing contributions of my colleague, Amanda. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Immigration Law Center, we're a nonpartisan national legal advocacy organization that works to advance and defend the rights of low-income immigrants and their families. And we do that through systemic litigation, policy advocacy, community education, and technical assistance to attorneys and advocates in the field. And we work on a variety of different substantive areas of law, but generally we focus on those that particularly impact low-income immigrants. So I'm going to start off by talking very briefly about the state of immigration reform at the federal level. And then I'm going to shift to talking about deferred action for childhood arrivals, as well as the expansion of that initiative and the deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents. And then finally, I'm going to talk about state policy options that states can enact, particularly or while immigration reform is unfortunately stalled at the federal level. Let's see. All right, so in terms of federal immigration reform, I want to start with a quick overview as a backdrop to the discussion. As most folks on the call are probably aware, the last major congressional effort to pass some kind of legislative immigration reform was back in 2013 when the Senate passed Senate Bill S-744 with bipartisan support that included 14 Republicans. Unfortunately, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives refused to bring Senate Bill 744 to a vote in the House or to offer its own alternative immigration reform bill. So as a result, S744 essentially expired or died at the end of the legislative term in 2014. And since then, no immigration reform efforts have advanced in Congress. And most folks think that the viability of any future efforts will depend heavily on what happens this fall in terms of both the presidential and the congressional elections. And during the push for S744, and then particularly in the wake of immigration reform legislation being stalled in the House of Representatives, immigrant advocates and their allies organized to persuade the president to exercise his inherent prosecutorial discretion to extend administrative relief to immigrants. And for folks that are interested in sort of the legal basis on which the president acted to provide administrative immigration relief, we have a variety of materials on our NILC website that really gets at the foundational or the foundation of the president's authority. As both Amanda and I have all previously mentioned, the original DACA initiative, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA for short, was announced in June of 2012. And that provides for authorization to live and work in the U.S. for 2-year renewable periods to individuals who arrived in the U.S. before the age of 16, who are enrolled in or completed a high school or GED program, or another qualifying educational program, and who've resided continuously in the U.S. since June of 2007, who was under the age of 31 as of June 2012 when the original DACA announcement was made, and who have not been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors. And as of March of this year, roughly 725,000 individuals had applied for and received DACA in the U.S. And I do want to note that the original DACA program is still in effect and going strong. The original DACA program was not directly at issue in the U.S. v. Texas lawsuit, which I'll be discussing in a little more detail in a minute. So original DACA remains available and the program remains live and in effect. Fast forward to November of 2014 when President Obama announced 2 new initiatives. The first being Deferred Action for Parents of Americans or Lawful Permanent Residents, or DAPA for short, and then an expansion of the original DACA program. I'm not going to go into too much detail about either of those, except to note that DAPA would have provided for deferred action or authorization to be in the U.S. and work authorization to parents who, as of November 2014, when the president made his announcement, had a son or a daughter who was either a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident and who met other requirements. The president also announced an expansion of the DACA program, which liberalized the eligibility requirements to make more individuals eligible. There is more detailed information about DAPA and expanded DACA on our NILC website, and those materials should be linked to in the resources guide as part of this webinar. I will note that both DAPA and the expansion of DACA are now temporarily enjoined by the courts while a lawsuit challenging the program is pending, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that lawsuit in a moment. But I did just want to note that it's estimated that nearly 5 million individuals would be eligible for DAPA or expanded DACA. So in terms of the lawsuit that I've already referred to, it's called Texas v. U.S., and in it, Texas and ultimately 25 other states sued the federal government to challenge the authority of the administration to enact DAPA and the expansion of DACA. And that lawsuit was filed in, I think it was December of 2014. I don't want to get too much into the sort of the weeds of the case, but I did want to note when talking about it at the outset that the judge hearing the case, Judge Hainan in the Southern District of Texas, was already on record in a prior case as strongly opposed to Obama's general immigration policies, and in fact in that prior case used very, very inflammatory language that's unusual for a federal district court judge in that prior decision. So Texas and the suing states, I think, filed this lawsuit purposely in the Southern District in order potentially to get before Judge Hainan, who was already known to be opposed to Obama's general immigration policies. And I've listed there the main legal issues that are at play in the case. I mean, there are really two primary issues. The first is called standing, which is a requirement to bring a lawsuit in federal court. And the party who's bringing the lawsuit must show that it has suffered a concrete and particularized injury as a result of the challenged action, and that a favorable court decision would redress that injury. And it's a major issue in the Texas v. U.S. case that boils down to essentially the question of what is the concrete and particularized injury that Texas and the other states have suffered as a result of DAPA and expanded DACA. And in the Texas case, the district court found that DAPA and expanded DACA create a new group of individuals who would be eligible to apply for driver's licenses in Texas. And because Texas subsidizes the cost of driver's licenses, the processing of these new applications for driver's licenses will cost the state money. So that's essentially the hook on which the district court has found standing. And then the other primary legal issue is whether these initiatives should have gone through a formal rulemaking procedure as opposed to being enacted as they were through executive memoranda. So if you want more information on sort of the underlying issues at play in the lawsuit, I'm happy to follow up with you after the webinar, and we do have a lot of information about the lawsuit on our website. In terms of the status of the lawsuit, the U.S. District Court, the Judge Hainan in the Southern District of Texas, granted a preliminary injunction which blocked DAPA and the expansion of DACA from going into effect. This was back in February of 2015. And that decision was upheld when the DOJ appealed it to the Fifth Circuit. And then the DOJ appealed that decision to the Supreme Court last December. Oral argument was heard before the Supreme Court in April of this year. And then in late June of this year, the Supreme Court, which as folks know is lacking a ninth justice since Justice Scalia passed away, failed to reach a substantive decision. They essentially deadlocked in a 4-4 opinion, a single line, which leaves the Fifth Circuit decision in place. And so essentially the Fifth Circuit's upholding of the district court's block of the programs remains in place while the case continues to unfold now in the district court in Texas. And again, I just want to note the original 2012 DACA initiative remains in effect, as that has not been directly challenged in the Texas case. In terms of next steps in the case, the Fifth Circuit preliminary injunction remains in place since the Supreme Court deadlocked. In July of this year, the Department of Justice, or the administration, filed a petition for rehearing before the full Supreme Court, essentially asking the Supreme Court to rehear the case when it has a full complement of 9 justices. So that petition was filed on July 18th of this year, and that can be decided by the Supreme Court essentially at any time, including in the next 2 months while the Supreme Court is technically on recess. We have been monitoring some petitions for rehearing that have been filed in other cases that led to a 4-4 deadlock in this term, and in at least one of them, the Supreme Court did ultimately deny that petition for rehearing. But thus far, the Supreme Court has not acted on the Department of Justice's request for rehearing in this case. So that request essentially is still outstanding and pending before the Supreme Court. And while it's pending, and it could pend indefinitely, the Supreme Court doesn't have, there's no timeline by which the Supreme Court has to rule on it, so it could remain pending for many months or even longer, or the Supreme Court could make a decision on it earlier. In the meantime, the case will continue to unfold at the district court, because you have to remember that all of the legal wrangling that's occurred around this case has all really focused only on the preliminary injunction that the district court issued back in February of 2015, temporarily blocking the programs from going into effect. But the actual merits of the case have not yet been decided. And then I did want to mention that we and other advocates are exploring other litigation strategies to try to unblock DAPA and the expansion of DACA, at least potentially in the 24 states that are not suing the federal government. But there's really no easy route to do that, and any new litigation will take time to unfold. So there's really no silver bullet here in terms of getting DAPA and the expansion of DACA implemented quickly. So in the face of all of that, the question then for states and localities is really whether states will invest in and ensure access to critical services and promote immigrant integration, or if so that immigrants can maximize their contributions to our communities, or if they're going to take steps to isolate and make life more difficult for immigrant families. And in highlighting the policymaking opportunities for states, I just wanted to flag that there are various ways that states can invest in immigration relief. I'm not going to talk about those in any detail here, but I did want to list out some things that states can do to facilitate immigration relief. In terms of specific policies, I've detailed out several different policies that states and localities can weigh in on, ranging from workers' rights to access to driver's licenses or municipal ID cards for immigrants, to access to counsel in removal proceedings, to limitations on state and local entanglement with federal immigration enforcement. These are all issues that NILC works on, so you can find out more about them by following up with me later or on our website. But in particular, I want to drill down on access to higher education and professional licenses. In terms of access to higher education, I wanted to highlight tuition equity policies that generally allow students who attend a state's high school for a certain number of years and who potentially meet certain other eligibility criteria to pay in-state tuition rates regardless of their immigration status. And these sorts of tuition equity policies typically apply across the board. So they don't, although they're often enacted and aimed at assisting undocumented youth or undocumented students, they typically also apply to citizens or apply regardless of immigration status. So folks who are here lawfully or are U.S. citizens can also potentially benefit from these policies. For example, if they have attended high school in a given state, then moved away and then returned, they may also be able to qualify for in-state tuition under these tuition equity policies. I also wanted to flag that often these tuition equity policies have bipartisan support, and we have seen them adopted in blue, red, and purple states. So this isn't just sort of a policy option for, for dyed-in-the-wool blue states. And at least 20 states currently have tuition equity laws or policies, and that covers roughly 75% of the foreign-born folks who live in the U.S. In addition, I've listed out the states there that offer state financial aid to students who are eligible for in-state rates regardless of immigration status. And then there are 4 states in particular, California, Illinois, and you'll see them listed there, Minnesota and Utah, who offer institutional aid or scholarships to students regardless of immigration status. And then in terms of DACA recipients' eligibility for in-state tuition, in states without tuition equity policies, access for DACA grantees may depend on a variety of factors, including how the state defines residency for tuition purposes, what the lawful presence or document requirements might be, and whether tuition is considered a public benefit. So it becomes sort of it's a very heterogeneous system in terms of DACA recipients' eligibility in states without explicit tuition equity policies. So really you have to kind of look at it state by state. And even within a state, the policy may vary depending on the institution or the college system. But I think the main takeaway here is that folks with DACA are considered by the federal government to be lawfully present in the U.S. and are thus not precluded from establishing domicile in the U.S. or in a given state. And so we've seen states as diverse as Arizona, Alabama, Ohio, and others that have determined explicitly that DACA grantees can establish residency for tuition purposes under their existing rules. And then there is some ongoing litigation in the states listed there around this issue. So shifting now to access to occupational licenses, as within state tuition, this is an issue we've seen addressed in blue, red, and purple states, and that often generates bipartisan support. I would say we haven't seen as much activity around access to occupational licenses as we have with tuition equity policies, but there seems to be a burgeoning interest in the field around expanding access to occupational licenses. So I want to note that immigrant access to occupational licenses is governed both by federal and state laws, and just at the outset note that occupational licenses or certifications are often required not only for professional positions such as attorneys, but also for a wide range of jobs with lower entry-level requirements. In California, that includes barber, cosmetologist, pest control applicator, and a variety of other jobs that require licensure or certification. So this isn't just about access to so-called professional licenses. So federal law expressly limits eligibility for state and local public benefits to qualified aliens, and it expressly defines public benefits to include professional licenses. And then the federal law defines qualified aliens to exclude undocumented individuals, but also to exclude some individuals who have lawful presence, including those with deferred action or temporary protected status. However, the federal law also affirmatively allows states to expand immigrant eligibility beyond this sort of default that the federal law sets if it does so by passing a state law expanding eligibility after August of 1996. And in our experience, this federal law has been very unevenly followed across the country, and there's not really a federal entity that enforces this law. So we have found that in some places, in some states, depending on the license, individuals who may not technically qualify as qualified aliens under the federal law may still have access to licenses. It really depends on the license at issue and the state. I did want to highlight 4 states that have addressed immigrant access to licenses and the different legislative or regulatory vehicles that each state took to get there. I would say probably the gold standard is California, who passed a landmark law called SB 1159 that provides for eligibility for professional and occupational licenses within the state regardless of immigration status, and that allows for the use of an ITIN, an individual taxpayer ID number, in lieu of a Social Security number. And that was a change that was made legislatively through a state law. In New York, they addressed the issue a little bit differently. There was a sort of a prior state Supreme Court case that held that a DACA grantee is eligible for a law license, and I think based on that decision, then the New York State Education Department, which regulates I think 53 professional licenses, in May of this year went through a rulemaking process and ultimately approved a rule that makes individuals who are not unlawfully present, so meaning individuals who are here with lawful presence, eligible for the 53 professional licenses under its purview. So this change doesn't reach undocumented individuals the way the California state law does, but it does reach those individuals who are here with lawful presence but aren't considered qualified aliens under the federal law, such as individuals who have deferred action, whether that's through DACA or through pre-existing deferred action that's been available for many, many years through USCIS. Nebraska recently, the legislature there overrode the governor's veto of a proposed state law to expand eligibility for professional and commercial licenses to immigrants with work authorization and who are listed in the Real ID Act of 2005. So that again reaches individuals who are here lawfully but aren't considered qualified aliens under the federal law. And then finally, Florida, in response to a state Supreme Court decision there that denied a DACA recipient a law license because of his status, the state passed a state law expanding eligibility for law licenses for individuals who came to the U.S. as a minor, who have work authorization, and who have been in the U.S. for more than 10 years. So I wanted to just kind of highlight those 4 states to kind of emphasize the range of policy options that states can pursue depending on the political landscape and what might be politically feasible there, from California at the most expansive and to Florida with its more narrow focus here on law licenses. And then to close out, I just wanted to note that that state-level work around issues like tuition equity and access to occupational licenses does feed back into the national conversation on immigration and helps shape that conversation while providing for real concrete improvements in immigrants' lives. And with that, I think I'll open it up for any clarifying questions.
Thanks, Josh. We did have one question, but I think we may reserve it for the Q&A portion of the call because I think it's likely to generate some good discussion. So Irene, do you want to go ahead and move into the next part of the presentation?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Amanda and Josh, for really giving us a lot of detail. I think part of the challenge here is both workforce and immigration funding has, as you showcased, its own set of technical expertise and terms and systems that families and workers and residents on the ground are interacting with. So it can feel a little overwhelming trying to learn both sides of the house, but really important. I think we wanted to spend just a couple of minutes really trying to generate not only discussion and additional questions, but also kick off by just giving a couple of funder examples. Myself and Matt are going to just sort of share where we've come to. And we would love it if other folks could type in and share what you're investing in and what you've learned so far. So I'm going to kick off by just sharing that at Casey we're a kids foundation, so the problem we were trying to solve is how do we close the skills and wage gap for adults with lower literacy and language levels, and particularly English language learners. And there are about 8 million adults nationally that with low literacy and language barriers who are raising children. So we're very focused on that segment of the adult low wage, low literate, low skill population. So our strategy was really to try and invest in evidence-based approaches which increased access and equity of opportunity. And so we made really 3 sets of investments. One was we joined a national initiative called Accelerating Opportunity. The second was we initiated some rapid prototyping in Maryland. And the third was we invested in a 4-state evidence-building consortium with 9 WIB community college partnerships that was a random-controlled trial. All of these had as a backbone an evidence-based bridge career pathway program out of Washington State known as the Integrated Basic Education and Skills Training Program. And it had some key features. One was it was well on its way in terms of rigorous evidence building. It had really this notion of busting barriers and accelerating credential attainment and skills building by having really a dual instructional model with an adult basic ed instructor and an occupational skills training instructor, 50% overlap in the classroom. And what they found was it was really that contextualized learning, combining the basic skills with occupational skills training that really did accelerate, because it was in the context if you were trying to get certified in carpentry skills, that's how you used your math and language skills or learning that in the context. So Accelerating Opportunity is now in 14 states. It was originally funded by the Ford Foundation. Then Gates picked it up and recruited, got co-investment from some of the funders on this call, Kellogg, Open Society, Kresge, Joyce. In Georgia, we co-invested in additional monies with the Arthur Blank and Woodruff Foundations and the University of Phoenix for the national effort. And that is also going through an evaluation. I think the kind of learnings really are that our bet and hypothesis was we wanted to see if we could adapt it in the rigorous evidence building stage to focus on employment outcomes, not really transition to credit pathways as part of a community college completion agenda, and for 7th to 10th grade literacy levels, and pretty short-term non-credit certificate training. The RCT evaluation results will be available in 2017, but some of the sites I think have some real promise. And it was really this notion is about for immigrant workers and folks who are older adults with children, it's less about workforce attachment and more about really just being stuck, that they can't advance to jobs with higher wages because they can't meet the cut scores for credit and credential and higher skills training, and they just were too far removed from high school to be able to, and they needed to work. So we'll see on that, and but that was sort of our approach. And then Matt, you were going to talk about, once again, kind of an emerging approach in the Chicago area. And then, as I say, while Matt and I are talking, if folks have other examples, we'd love to hear about it. And if you could just, add that to your chat question, that would be terrific. So I'm going to ask Matt to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we wanted to give this example because we're at a much earlier stage. We're very, very sort of nascent in this space. About a year ago, our funder collaborative I just got the sense this is an area that we wanted to learn more about. So we're a funder collaboration, about a dozen funders focused in the Chicago region. We're an affiliate of the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. Our mission is about increasing employment, earnings, and racial equity in the Chicago region for workers. And that racial equity piece is something we added in the last year as part of our evolution as a funder collaboration. And so we've been trying to be more explicit and intentional about what we learn about and what we focus on as a funder collaborative with racial equity as a focus. And so this area of learning more about immigration and immigrants and immigration issues is something we've been trying to do. What we realized last year is that there was another funder collaborative in Chicago, which of course we all knew about, which is our Immigration Funders Collaborative, also hosted here at the Chicago Community Trust, but we had never explicitly sort of talked to each other and talked to these as funders in one larger group. And so we arranged to do that, and there was not 100% overlap, but there was a lot of overlap in that the foundations that are part of our funder collaborative also were involved in the Immigration Funder Collaborative, but usually a different program officer. And so we had the interesting experience where we would ask these foundations to come to a joint meeting, and they weren't sure who to send. We really wanted them to send both to sort of make the point that we're trying to break down these silo between funding areas. And we had an informational session last year, which is very similar to the content we just looked at, where the workforce funders were really learning about the immigration issues, DACA, DAPA, which was at a different point last summer, but was still very topical. And the immigration-focused funders were learning about the workforce issues. So we were just creating this shared space where we could learn each other's issues. And we're still in that process, so we're still early stages. But I think what we see coming together is that if the foundations don't know each other's issues, then the practitioners, our grantees, we see they often don't know these issues as well, and there could be an opportunity to help that in the field. And actually, one of our funders, the community trust here, has sort of gone further down this path, and when we're going to learn from them about what they're doing there, where they're working with grantees or social service organizations that have both immigration services, which would include DACA legal services, as well as workforce services within the same organization, and looking at how referrals within that organization can be improved so those services can be more coordinated. And that's really interesting, but you can also see how a logical next step to that would be looking at how those services could be coordinated across different organizations. Because at least what we see in Chicago, a lot of the organizations that our immigration funders are funding to, say, provide DACA services are wholly different organizations than the organizations that are providing workforce services. And really those things should be connected better, whether that's smoother, cleaner referrals or just sort of cross-training about each other's issues. And it seems so logical with the DACA issue because obviously DACA is about grants work status. But there's also a cost to it, and so if you haven't gotten a job as a result of getting work status, there's no incentive or less incentive to get reauthorized for it. So there's just logical places these come together that we're exploring as our two local funder groups.
Great. Well, we wanted to invite if there are any other funder examples, and then we're going to, I think Caleb will unmute the lines for sort of an open chat discussion.
The conference has been unmuted. The conference has been unmuted.
So I know that Lena had an example, Lena Avedon had an example that she wanted to share around domestic workers. Lena, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Felicia asked me to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we were supporting to improve the economic security of low-income immigrant families. We support a large cohort of day labor programs in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it came to our attention that wage theft was a really huge problem that was affecting the pocketbooks of all of these workers. And so with the support of a couple of other funders, a partnership of other funders, we launched a partnership between the Employment Law Center, a legal services provider, and 2 day laborer programs, which is actually modeled on a pilot program developed in Los Angeles between Endelon and the Wage Justice Center. And the program is designed to educate day labor program staff and lay outreach workers on how to educate other workers about the use of the mechanics lien. Now this is it's a process that's probably, I don't know how unique it is to the state of California, but a lot of these wage and hour laws go state by state. So in this particular case, this is a method by which employers can, with the help of an advocate, file a claim to recover wages that has a much higher recovery rate than that of the Labor Commission. So that's one of the things that we're doing. I'm very happy to share details about that if anybody is interested. And then the other thing is that, and I apologize because I wasn't on the early part of the call, so you may have already talked about this. We're supporting a really interesting partnership between a community college and a day labor center in one region, whereby the community college is doing a combined vocational English as a second language and skills development in partnership with the day labor program. And one of the big roles of the day labor program is to make sure that the workers who are enrolled in these classes persist, and that's a very promising partnership. And then lastly, we've been supporting the California Domestic Workers Coalition community organizing and advocacy to make permanent a temporary improvement to wage and hour laws for domestic workers in the state.
Great, thank you very much. So let's spend the last 10 minutes really on doing 2 things. One, inviting any other questions, Sarah, that either came to you as the chat moderator or in this open discussion. And then we just wanted to make sure we invite folks to, although we may send this out as well, just a couple of polling questions to inform GCIR and Workforce Matters on some possible next steps.
Great. Well, this is Sarah. We did have a couple of other questions that came in over the chat, so I'll throw those out there. And I think Josh and Amanda, there may be some interest in getting some response from you. One question for Josh. You mentioned some policies in Nebraska. Can you tell us what the driver for those policies were?
Yes. I mean, a red state like Nebraska, you might not anticipate that a Republican-controlled legislature would overturn the veto of a Republican governor. But I think the arguments that really were persuasive in Nebraska to legislators around expanding access to occupational licenses were really economic ones, and to some degree they were rooted in the fact that Nebraska does have a tuition equity law or policy on the books. And so one of the arguments that seemed to be persuasive and was made indeed by a Republican legislator was, that the state was investing in DACA grantees and in other immigrant youth to attend higher education in the state, with in-state tuition rates. And that it did not make economic sense to essentially invest in these individuals' education, but then not allow them to access professional licenses or certifications that were necessary for them to perform the work essentially that they had been educated for. And in fact, the Republican legislator made an argument about Iowa and losing folks, and I think this is probably a big issue in Nebraska, losing residents to Iowa. Where folks could just move across state lines essentially and then be able to obtain a license or certification that they were, prior to the law being enacted, not eligible for in Nebraska. So it really was both an economic argument that was premised on the state's previously existing tuition equity policy, and then also sort of a interstate competition in terms of not wanting to lose students or individuals that the state has invested in to surrounding states with more liberal occupational license laws.
Great. And then we also had a question. Someone would like to know about whether states and regions can collect data about nativity and immigration status and their WIOA or workforce programs if they want to, or if there's something about that that's expressly forbidden.
So to the best of my knowledge, there is actually nothing that would forbid states from collecting that. And in fact, it's likely that in many cases states are collecting it at some point. They're just not reporting it to the federal government, and they may not be aggregating it at the state level. And the reason that I say that that's likely is you'll remember that for WIOA Title I, you have to be work authorized. And so it's very common for states to require, for example, that if you're enrolling in a WIOA Title I service, that you show your proof of work authorization, your U.S. birth certificate, your U.S. passport, your green card. And so in states that are doing that, that information would, of course, help to determine nativity in many cases, not all cases. But we actually did a 2-page fact sheet at National Skills Coalition last fall about workforce data and immigration and sort of what the opportunities are to collect better data. And so if folks are interested in that question, I'll make sure that that fact sheet gets added to the resources page for this webinar.
Thanks, Amanda. And finally, one more question from the chat, and this may be something that generates some discussion among the the call participants as well as the speakers. But we had a question: what are immigrant advocates doing regarding the 2/3 of immigrants who have legal status but are stuck in low-wage jobs? And they go on to say that this is really less about their legal status, but more about their English sufficiency skills.
Yeah, I can talk about a couple of things. So there are different ways to attack this problem, right? The first is to say, could we do more for upskilling people within their current jobs, right? So there are groups like, for example, Jewish Vocational Services in Boston that provides a lot of incumbent worker training. They work with employers who have current employees who have English language needs, and they help those current employees learn more English to be able to move up and do day shift work or do, front desk work or do some higher level job that can enable them to earn better wages. So there are nonprofit organizations that are tackling that question in partnership with employers. The second sort of piece of the puzzle is labor management partnerships. And these are agreements that are part of collective bargaining agreements for labor unions. You could imagine building and janitorial union or a hospital healthcare workers that are unionized, or hospitality workers who do banquet serving or food service. And in that case, the contract, the union contract between the employer and the employees dictates that a portion of everybody's wages will get put into a training fund, right? So I get paid 25 cents less per hour, but that money, my employer puts it into the training fund, and that training fund can be used for upskilling. So Building Skills Partnership in California is one example. The Hospitality Training Academy is another. A lot of these unions are heavily immigrant unions, so the overwhelming number of their participants are immigrants. And so the training that they provide is often focused on skills that immigrants need. And it could be something that is like English, sort of a transferable skill across jobs, or it could be a more narrowly technical skill. So for example, BFP does training in helping janitors be certified to work in LEED certified buildings, that is, buildings that are environmentally conscious buildings. And so they call it their Green Janitor Training Program. So the labor management partnerships are another sort of program model for helping immigrant workers who are currently in low-wage jobs build skills and move into higher wage jobs. And then the sort of third puzzle piece is trying to create job training opportunities that are sort of practical and reasonable for an immigrant to complete, even while they're also holding down a job to feed their families, right? How can we create a community college training program or a day laborer training program or whatever it might be in a way that is accessible even for people who are also trying to make a living, who in most cases can't stop working to go through a training program. And we heard from Lena earlier about one example of a partnership between a day labor worker center and a community college. The Casey Foundation and the Ford Foundation have actually funded 8 of these nationwide. But there's a number of other programs that are not specific to day laborers that are really trying to say, okay, can we work with a refugee resettlement agency? Can we work with another community-based nonprofit that immigrants already know and trust the organization, and the organization knows their immigrant workers well enough to know what the timing and scheduling would need to be to create a job training program that people could participate in even as they're holding down another job. So those are 3 of the models that folks use to support immigrants who are in low-wage jobs and need to skill up to get into better wage jobs, but there are a variety of other models as well. And I don't know if either Josh or Irene have others to add, or if there may be other listeners on the call who would like to chime in as well.
So this is Irene. I'm mindful of the time, and that we wanted to invite folks for any other clarifying questions, but also get our, some of these polling questions up before folks. So, Caleb, should I turn it over to you for the polling questions?
Yeah, thank you, Irene. So we have just a couple of polling questions today. First question is going to be, would you like to be included in future conversations on this topic and or receive additional information to support your grant making related to workforce issues?
So you can just hit yes or no and then submit. Does the question have to remain on the screen in order for the responses to be
It does,
captured?
and we have just maybe 30 more seconds, and we'll advance to the next question.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Great.
And for our last question is, what is one thing you learned during today's webinar that will inform your future grant making? And just a reminder, if you could please mute yourselves. And Irene, I'd like to go ahead and turn things back over to you.
Great, thanks. Well, we have 2 minutes before we end, and so I really wanted to say I think we heard, boy, a lot of really good information about what are the barriers to access and advancement across adult education and workforce skills training systems, this need to customize approaches. I think this interesting theme about invisibility of the population in terms of what data is being collected and figuring that out, and then really making these existing new policy opportunities work for immigrants and making visible existing legislation and models to other policymakers, practitioners, and funders. So I want to just end by really thanking all of you who took quite a lot of time out of your day to participate in the webinar. We are going to have a resource page, and to thank Josh and Amanda very much for really putting together a thoughtful but comprehensive set of presentations. So thank you, everyone. And I see Josh or Caleb has put up the resource page. Thank you. It's 4 o'clock, so we'll invite folks to go to the next part of their day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Irene. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.